Hey, what's up YouTube? I'm Nick Frosty, and in this PHP tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a simple search engine using PHP, an HTML form, and a MySQL database. The entire source code for this tutorial will be available via the link in the description. If you find this video helpful, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell notifications so that way you can keep up to date anytime new tutorials come out. Let's go ahead and get started. Start now with a basic HTML structure setup, just displaying a title to the user and then giving a little bit of formatting for the actual page itself. So if you take a look at the HTML page itself, it's just giving us a little light blue background with a simple rounded white box in the middle. And this white area is just going to be where our content is going to be displayed. Right above it is where we're going to have our very simple header with just links to go to the different pages. And then in the footer, you can have whatever text you want down there. Entirely up to you. So let's go ahead and start with creating our top header area, just to give a little bit of nice navigation to navigate between the different pages that we'll have. And since I already have the CSS styles already created for this, I already have all the names in my head for the actual divs and different elements that we're going to be creating. But basically, we're just going to create a super quick links to the two different pages, both the index page and the new entry page. So once we've got those created, we can go ahead and refresh the page itself, and it'll just give us a nice little display of an H1 tag, just giving a nice big text that you can click on to go between the two different pages, and then a simple link to go to our new entry page, which is starting out blank, and we'll move on to that later. So now that we've got our header created, we're going to create a very simple form that's going to be shown to the user that's going to allow them to actually search in the database for any of the things that are in there. So our form is going to have an action that's going to be left blank, and it's going to have a method of equal to get. That's get in all caps, and give it a name of also blank. So having an action that's left blank will make it so anytime that form is submitted, it's just resubmitted to the same file or the same script that you're already on. So in this case, we're on the index.php script. So if the user clicks a submit button, it'll just reload that page itself, that index.php page. When we get into the new entry script, we'll do the same thing, but it'll be just resending that data into the new entry.php script. And then we're having a method of get, which means once the form is submitted, it's actually sending all of the form data in the URL. And I'll show you what that looks like later. The alternative to that is post, which will make it so that any of the form data, like our keywords, are submitted somewhat hidden to the user. They're not actually going to see it. But typical search engines actually use it in the get method. Means you don't have to constantly refresh the page. So if you hit F5 or refresh your browser, you don't have to click the pop-up that says resubmit this form and have to acknowledge it and whatnot. It just adds to a better overall user experience. So now we're just going to create a very simple table in order to show the simple form to the user. Now, this form is just going to have two form elements, and those are going to be a text box and a submit button. So we're going to go ahead and create those now. So we're going to create the input type of text, and we're going to give it a name of K. So K will be short for keywords, and having a shorter name on your inputs that are within your get form will just make it so there's less information actually being passed in the browser, and it just makes it look a little bit cleaner. I'm going to set a placeholder equal to search for something. So a placeholder attribute will actually make it so when the page loads up, when you have no default value, it'll have like a lighter version of whatever your placeholder text is. It's a lighter value, and as soon as the user starts typing in that text box, it'll actually it'll do away with that placeholder text and actually just display their text that they've typed. Now we're going to create a new input also for our submit button, so input type of submit. So by clicking this button, this submit button, the form will actually be submitted, so that way the script can process all the information. I'm going to give it a name that's equal to blank, and I'll discuss that later, and give it a value of search. So if we save and refresh our script itself, we now have our super simple search box that we can see our placeholder text there. That it's kind of a little bit lighter, and then if you go to just type any text, it'll keep that text in there and do away with your placeholder text. And then you've got your search button itself. So if you were to search for something, say hello, and you hit the search button, it'll reload and it'll pass your parameters in your URL, since we're using a get method of our form. So the reason I chose the K as the name for the text box itself for our keywords, it makes it so you just have less in your URL by having keywords equal to hello, which looks a little bit nicer. And then if you have a submit button, if you have any name, so if we name it button, and you reload the page and search for something, you now have this button equal to search. So it's going to actually pass all of the parameters associated with that form element in your URL as well. But since we don't actually need any of that information, I like to set it to a blank name attribute, so that way it doesn't actually get submitted with the form. The script itself is smart enough to understand that you just don't care about that information at all. And I'm just going to center this so it looks a little bit nicer. And there we go. So now we've got our very simple form set up, so that way we can actually start processing all the data and connecting to our database and whatnot. So the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to set up our database itself. So I'm going to log into phpMyAdmin to create a new database and a new table for the database. So I'm inside of my tutorials database, and I'm going to create a new table, and I'm just going to call it search engine. And the number of columns that we're going to need is we're actually going to use a total of 5 different columns. So the ones we're going to need are an ID, a title, a blurb or description for whatever information you're having displayed to the user. We're going to have the actual URL that the user is going to be taken to when they click on it, and then the actual search keywords themselves. So total of 5. So now we're just going to go ahead and type in each of those different names into the name column for each of our table columns themselves. So ID, title, blurb, URL, and keywords. Well, if I could spell it. Keywords. So the type that we're going to use for each of these different columns are going to be a little bit different. So the ID is going to be an auto-incrementing element, so you're going to click the auto-increment button, and it's also going to set it to a primary key. And you can just go ahead and hit the go button, so that way it acknowledges that it's going to be a primary key. And basically, that's just going to be a unique identifier in the entire database column, or the entire database table, rather, that is going to allow you to easily search through and index any of the information that's in your database itself. Our title, I'm going to set to a varchar of, we'll say, 200 characters. Don't imagine any of the titles being very long. We'll have a blurb, that'll be set to text, and we'll set that to 500 characters. So basically, we're just allowing each of our descriptions for each of the search items in the database to just have a 500 character description length. Our URL, we're going to set to a text, and we're going to set that to a 1,000 character length, because some URLs can get pretty lengthy, but generally speaking, your URLs will probably be less than 1,000 characters, and if they are, they'll just be truncated right there where they're at. And then we're going to set our keywords also to a text, and we'll set it to 1,000 characters as well. So keywords will be each of the actual words themselves that we're going to use in our database. So once you've got all that information entered, go ahead and hit the save button. And then now we have our very basic table created with no data inside of it. So if you click the browse button, you'll see that there's no information itself. Now for the first couple of pieces of information in the database, the first couple of search options, we're going to go ahead and manually insert some, so that way there are some elements in the database. So I'm just going to enter in a couple of them here. So once you've got into the keywords portion, the keywords, how our search engine is going to be set up, it's going to search through each of the keywords separated by the space. You can do it a couple of different ways. You can separate each of them by a space or a comma, quotation marks, whatever your own preference is. But I'm just going to be separating each of my keywords by a space. So that way when we search through the database itself, we'll be segmenting all of our keywords by a space character. Hit go to save that entry. So now if we browse over to all the entries in our database, you can see that we have 3 entries now in the database. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to determine if the user has actually submitted the search form and provided us with the keywords themselves. So we're going to create an if statement. So using the isSet function will actually allow us to search to determine if the variable or the information that we're entering in as the first parameter in the isSet function will actually tell us if that parameter exists. So it's a really good way to help prevent getting any errors or warnings on your code itself. So we're going to use the _get variable to get all the variables from the URL, and then we're specifically caring about the k, and then we're going to check to make sure that basically k is set. And then we also want to make sure that it does not equal to 0 or nothing, a blank string. So you can basically submit the form and k will be set in the URL itself, but it can be set to nothing. So if we were to search for, just hit enter on our form, you can see that k is in fact set in the URL itself, which would trigger this event, but because there's effectively no search keywords, it's useless. And like any good coder, you want to make sure you comment out your code to help you back in the future when you're trying to figure out what your code actually does. So the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to save our keyword variable into a variable that we can easily manipulate all the data for. So we're going to call it the k variable, our _get, our get variable, and our k name. And I'm actually going to use the trim function. So the trim function will actually make it so any of the information that you pass as the parameter, it's going to cut off any of the extra spaces or tabs that are on the inside and the outside of the string itself. So say you had something like this is your variable data, you have a space and then a character and then a space. Well, that's actually going to convert it over to just having the 2 spaces on the ends removed. So it just makes it a little bit cleaner, so that way you're not going to be searching your database for a space, because that's going to be our delimiter, as it's called. It's going to be the actual character that we're going to separate each of our keywords by. So now that we have our keywords from the user, we need to actually separate each of those keywords into an individual word itself. So we're going to store all of these in a keywords variable. And like I said, we're going to use the explode function. Now the explode function typically takes 2 parameters. The first parameter is called your delimiter, and that's actually the string or character that you want to separate each of your keywords out in this case. So it's going to take an entire string and it's going to segment it at each of these characters, in this case a space, and that's going to store that into an array that we're calling keywords. So the first parameter is the delimiter, and the second parameter is your input string itself. So if you print the array itself, you can see you're printing an array, our index auto increments up, and it separates each of those out. So in order to process each of the keywords themselves individually, so that way we can add it to a string, we're going to use a ForEach loop. And now our ForEach loop is going to take each of our keywords, and it's going to make each of those, store each of those as a word variable. So that way, if we just print out each of the words themselves, you can see it's very similar. Instead of printing out an array, it just prints out the words themselves. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually use each of these words, and we're going to create our MySQL query that we're going to run through the database. So anytime you use a query, you're always typing in the same exact thing. So select asterisk from database name, where ID equals 1 or keywords equals keywords. So we need to create that initial base of the query. So select all from search engine, since that was the name of our database table itself, and then where. So if we echo out our query string right at the end here, you'll see we're starting to build our search query. So right now, if we were to use this query and submit it to the database using a MySQL connection, then you would get kicked an error because this isn't proper syntax for a query, because you have just this extra where at. But using our ForEach loop, we're going to append each of our words in a specific SQL formatted string onto our query string in order to actually search the database for each of those. So we're going to take our query string and we're going to say dot equals, so append onto our initial, and we're just going to type in our keywords. And we're going to use our query, and we're actually going to search for all of the keywords in the keywords column in our database table, and where keywords are like, and then we're going to hit 2 single quotes, and then inside of those single quotes we're going to have 2 parentheses, and then inside of those parentheses we're going to have our actual word itself. So right now, because we've searched for 2 words, if we refresh the page, you can see we are selecting all from search engine, where keywords is like hello, that's misspelled, and keywords like our next keyword. So you can see that it's going to update every time you enter a new search term, but when you're searching for multiple terms like this, you need an and or an or in there. So we'll go ahead and throw that or and refresh. So now you're searching where your keywords are like hello or keywords are like there. Now the reason we're using a parenthesis on each side is because this is actual SQL syntax. So if you use a parenthesis, it's like a wildcard. So you're basically saying you want to search for anything at the beginning of our keywords that has there on it, anywhere in the middle, and then it can have anything at the end. So now that we've gotten our base query created, we need to remove a little bit of text from our query string itself. So if you look at our query string, it has this extra or at the very end of it. So I want to actually get rid of that, so that way we don't get kicked back any errors on our SQL query itself. So in order to do that, we're going to create a substring that's our query string, so the substr function. So we're going to take our query string as our first parameter. The second parameter is where you're starting in the string itself. So we're going to start at the very beginning, so starting at the 0 position, and the length of the text that we're actually trying to cut out, or trying to retain rather. So we're trying to cut out the last 3 characters from the string itself. So we're actually going to use a strlen function. So we're going to get the string length of our query string, and we're going to subtract 3 from it, and we're still going to echo that out. So basically we're just creating our substring that's going to take our total query string itself. We're going to start at the very beginning, so position 0, and we're going to take it to the length minus 3. So what that's going to do is that's just going to cut out the last 3 characters from the string itself. And then if you refresh the page, you can see that that last little bit of or for our or statement goes right away. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to connect to the database, so that way we can actually run our query against the database. So we're going to create a connect database, or a connect variable, and so MySQL _ connect. MySQL connect function takes 4 parameters. The first one is the server. The next parameter is the username for the account, followed by the password, and followed by the database name. Now, like I said at the beginning, I'm going to store all of these variable names inside of a different file, the index or the include.php, so that way it's a lot easier to adjust them. So we're going to load up our index.php file, and then we're going to just define each of these variables. So my server is localhost. My username is root. My password is password. And my database name was tutorials. because if you look back at MySQLiMyAdmin, or phpMyAdmin, sorry, you can see the database name is tutorials, and our table is search engine. So now that we have our include username, our database connection information, we need to actually include that file in our PHP script itself. So I'm going to do it right at the top using the include function. It's just going to say to basically include that include file. So include.php. So it's just going to load up that PHP script into our script itself. So at this point, we should be successfully connected to the database. And if we go ahead and refresh our page, our string should go away, and we should not have any database errors, which, we have database error because I am bad at typing. Server. And this is user, server user pass name. All right, now if we refresh it, shouldn't have any database errors. There we go. So we've successfully connected to the database itself. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to process our query in order to search the database. So we're going to take the MySQLi underscore query function, and this function takes two parameters. The first parameter is your MySQL connection, so our con variable, and the next one is going to be our search string, or rather our query string. And then we're also going to check to see how many results will actually come back to the user based off of whatever search terms that they're actually searching for. So we're going to call that results. We'll call it result count. So we're going to use the MySQLi underscore num underscore rows function, and we're just going to pass in our query. So this is actually just going to tell us how many results have been returned, just a pure number. It's just going to return an integer. Create a very simple if statement and echo out some information. So we're going to say if our result count is greater than or equal to or greater than 0, which means at least one result has been returned, and then we're going to process everything in here. If no results have been returned, we want to display a message to the user. So now that we get into this area here, this is actually going to be us displaying all of our search information back out to the user. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to display the search result count. So we'll just echo out a very simple div. So now if we refresh, no results found for our search terms themselves. So hello there when we search for. So if we search for something we know is in the database, like search engine, we can see we have 2 results found, and it displays it over to the right because that's how my CSS styling is set up. Something else we might want to display to the user is what their actual search was, so that way it's being displayed back to the user, so that way they can actually easily tell what they searched for in case they have any question about it. So in order to do that, we need to go back up to our ForEach loop, and we're going to create a new variable called let's call it display words. Display underscore words. And we're going to just add each of our words to it. And we're going to put a space right after it. And much like when we created our query string itself, we need to initiate that variable to start with. Whoops. And we're just going to set that equal to a blank query, or a blank string. So initially they're searching for no words, and then we're going to add a new word every single time. So now if we echo out a new line just to display the words back to the user, so if we refresh now, you can see we now have a piece of text that says your search for, and our search words resulted in 2 results, and then a nice horizontal line just to make it a little bit nicer looking. And I'm going to throw a new line right above that. So it gives a little bit extra space. So now we've displayed our search header. We're going to actually cycle through every single result that we got from our search query and display those individually to the user. So in order to do this, we're going to use a while loop, and our while loop is going to allow us to process through every single result that was returned to us. But we need to get those results using the fetch associative array function, and we're going to store each of those in a variable known as, we'll call it row. So equals MySQLi underscore fetch underscore assoc, and then pass in our query. So it's going to process through every single result that was returned from our query. It's going to store it in an associative array, so just an array, and in the variable known as row. So now we just have to process our row variable and just display that out to the user. Now every single entry will be under the same row variable every time it gets processed through, so we just have to process it one time. Makes it a lot easier to process. And I'm going to put all these in a table, so I'll put the table header here at the top. And we're just going to figure out a nice little convenient way to format all of our entries. So if you refresh the page, since we returned 2 results from our search for search engine, you have a title, a blurb, and a URL just displayed right out to the user, making it nice and simple. But we want to actually process in all that information that gets returned from the row variable. So now if we refresh the page, you can see we're displaying out each of the information from the database. So our title, our blurb itself, and our URL. Now I'm going to change up a little bit of the styling for this, just to make it look a little bit neater. Just going to change up our table to make it so each of those pieces of information is effectively on a new line. So it makes it a little bit neater, easier to read. Now, like any good search engine, you have to actually be able to click on the links. So we want to make our title clickable, as well as the, we'll just make the title clickable. So we'll make the title clickable, and then in order to do that, we'll just put each of those in a h tag. So a href equals, and this will be to our row variable and to our URL. And then you want to close out of the a tag. And I'm actually going to put mine inside of a h3 tag just to make it stand out a little bit more. And then I'm going to make the row italics, or the URL italics. That way it looks a little bit nicer to the user. So if we refresh the page now, you can see that our URL itself is italics, and then our link is clickable. So if you click it, it'll load up Google right away, or Bing, whatever your search engine is supposed to return. So we can try searching for something else. So both of those results have the search engine term inside the keywords. If you search for one of our other results, you can see that our search engine seems to be fully functional so far. The next thing we want to do is we want to actually be able to add additional entries to the search engine itself with ease, not having to go back through phpMyAdmin in order to manually add each of those. So that's where our new entry file is going to come in handy.